Hello, and welcome to the Northern Iron podcast. I'm your host Lily Busby, and today I have Brian Pelan with me, who is the co-founder and editor of View Digital.
In this episode, we will discuss what the platform is, the role journalists have in publishing stories about social affairs, and a bit about the types of stories they publish. So, Brian, can you tell us a bit about what View Digital is?
View Digital is a social enterprise company. We were set up in 2012. There was two co-founders at the start. Myself and Una Murphy set up View Digital. But I was always interested in social affairs. It's something that interested me. A lot of papers I worked for, I didn't think they were giving them enough coverage, and also how they covered them was a problem for me. So when I had the opportunity and also to take a sort of leap into the unknown to do this, I embraced it.
And how do you feel newspapers, the ones you work in, how do you feel that they portrayed social and political stories wrong?
Well, some of them done it very badly in terms of a lot of stereotypes. A lot of the newspapers, it's what I would call surface reporting. They'll report an issue, they'll get different views on the issue, and then they'll move on. Or sometimes they'll just ignore the issue, or they'll cover it badly. And a lot of times I'm interested in what's behind the issue. What are the real opinions on the issue in terms of a range of good sources? So when we cover an issue, we've done an issue on suicide prevention, for instance, and with that we worked with someone who was who had direct knowledge of suicide and the terrible effects of it on families and friends if someone takes their own life. And then we had a number of people who'd lost people to suicide, with people, academics writing about suicide. We had articles about what sort of strategies could be adopted to tackle suicide. So we go into the issue really deeply. It takes about 3 months to do an issue of the magazine. And we also as the editor of it, we do what I would call very responsible journalism. So for instance, when we're covering domestic violence, if women didn't want their names to be used, we would give them a different name. If they didn't want their photograph taken, that was fine. As long as I could make sure the story was authentic, then I would bring in all those safeguards into the magazine. So people who'll come and talk to me, and I've had many people from many different issues talking to me about issues which they're vulnerable, they're very tough, difficult issues, and not to trust you. Trust is a key word, and anybody who writes for me understands that I take it very, very seriously.
And do you feel that other papers, like other mainstream newspapers, do you feel like they perhaps don't take people's concerns into consideration? Do you feel like they don't effectively report stories ethically?
Well, for instance, if you look at newspapers now, a lot of it can veer on being sensationalized. So something big happens, there's a big sensational headline, some big tragedy has happened, and then the paper, because that's what it does, it moves on to other stories. Whereas we tend to stay with a story and try and give it more depth in terms of what's involved in it. For instance, we're constantly talking about housing and housing problems and housing issues. But what we argue in View Digital, there are solutions out there. So we just don't believe in analysing the piece. We sort of say, where does responsibility lie? What's going wrong here? But all we can do is publish the stories. But a lot of papers just don't have social affairs correspondents. A lot of papers have cut back in these areas, and I think these areas are key. That people work in these areas, write about these areas, and get to know the stories.
Have you seen a sort of increase in the types of stories being submitted to View Digital?
Well, an issue that we've covered again and again and again is housing. Housing is a big issue because housing is central to people's lives. And there's more and more people in Ireland, again in Northern Ireland, the Republic, who are homeless. The figures have went up, people living on the streets, etc. I've certainly witnessed the increase of it over the last lot of years. That's an issue that keeps coming back and back. and the issue of homelessness, and then the things that come from that. So addiction, drug addiction, etc. When people's lives are in turmoil, and they've got an addiction, and they haven't got a house, and their homelessness, their situation becomes more severe. And therefore, we've witnessed a number of people, even in Belfast, of the last year, even the last year, dying on the streets. And to me, that's an indictment on our society. Human beings are lying on the streets with addiction issues, and they're dying from them. That's something that what a journalist, a good journalist, in my opinion, should be doing two things. One is that they should be reporting on that and writing about that. And number two, they should be talking to the politicians and the other decision makers. What are they doing about it? And then number three, also, the journalists should start reading and looking out for what solutions are out there. Are other countries doing things differently? And then what do you call it then? See if they can write those pieces and put them out. In other words, to try and give your readers a really good understanding of the story.
And do you feel like solution-based news would be better than current news at the moment, where it just says what's happening, reports on it, and then it moves on?
Yes, I think what it's called, that's what we get. Sometimes we'll have a half-hour maybe news program in the night, and obviously because it's only half an hour, it can only cover in brief parts of any stories. But I think yes, it's essential that we have much longer news programs, which I would call investigative journalism, and where the journalists who are working on that program have a longer period to work on stories and then really dig deep. What I'm looking for is more considered journalism, more specialist journalism, more investigative journalism, and just that putting the resources into those types of areas to me is very, very important.
Do you feel the journalist role should evolve from just simply reporting and informing to more of almost an activist form of reporting?
I mean, as a journalist, some people would say I'm an activist journalism. I'm very much on the side of the underdog. But then you have to ask yourself, why am I a journalist? What is it that attracted you to it? Yeah, it's interesting where the work has taken me. But as I said, at the end of the day, we can only cover a certain amount of stories, but we'll try to do them to the best of our ability. I wish I had the resources of the big organizations. I wish I had many more people as staff. I wish we were bigger, but that's all. That's just wishful thinking. But yes, we could do a lot more if we had a bigger budget. It's expensive producing these magazines to try and raise funds to produce them. It's a challenge every time. So yeah, it's not easy, but it's the best for me personally. Other people can have another view, but for me personally, this is the best journalism I've ever done, and I'm always learning.
And how important do you feel it is to get readers talking about these current issues?
Well, first of all, you write the stories. You can't make readers talk about issues. You write the stories. You put the stories out there. And if your stuff is good, if your material is good, and you've done your research, I would argue, and people are already talking about that issue, so it's something that people are talking about, then your story will add to that. It's not that your story suddenly is going to have thousands of people banging on your door and saying that's great journalism. It doesn't work like that. First of all, look to your story, and then it's a bit like an author when they write a book, and it's put out there. You do it with the best of your intentions. You do it with the best of your abilities. But how many people read it? How many people want to discuss it? Sometimes we have very few people reading our stories. Sometimes we'll do a piece, and there will be many thousands reading it. You can't always measure that, and I'm not dictated by clickbait. In other words, how many hits a story gets. That's to me, that's the road to ruin, because then your stories will get more simpler and simpler. You'll be looking for certain words, sensational words, etc., that'll get those hits, or something very shallow. But we have become consumed by this now. How many people now sit on buses and public transport and other places just scrolling, endlessly scrolling? How many people are not reading books now?
And how does it make you feel to make such an impact on viewers?
I think it's a crucial role being a journalist. It's a great privilege to be a journalist, to talk and interview people. Anytime I do it, I always feel like how good this is. I mean, there was one time we done this on suicide prevention, as I've spoken about, and we launched that magazine in Belfast, the big theatre in Belfast, when we launched that issue of View. And there was over 300 people at that launch, and at least 200 of them had all lost someone to suicide. I mean, it was phenomenal. And so I spoke very little. I really didn't want to say very much to that sort of audience, just why we'd done the magazine. And when I was leaving the platform, a woman came to me. She lives in India now, but at that time she was working as a doctor in London. And she had written for a View about her son, who was a young student who had taken his own life. And she had written a piece for View about the loss of her son. And she came to speak to me, and she gave me a big hug. And I said to her, "Why are you hugging me?" And she said, "Because you've written about this subject." I just think there's a need for this sort of journalism. I think there's a need to give people a platform for this sort of journalism, and to write about it. As I say, there's no one else that I know is doing this sort of in-depth journalism. And it's generally all pretty serious stuff. You know, I know what I do makes me feel good. I'm interested in this sort of journalism. I've had the opportunity and a lot of hard work from me and Una and everyone else involved with you. It's been hard work to do this. It mightn't go on forever. You know, I can't go on forever. But yes, it's good. And if I can give any kind of assistance or help to young journalists coming in, then I'm keen to do that.
Well, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
And to you, the listeners, for tuning in. Till next time, stay tuned and we'll talk later.